17, my Amish grandmother changed every family story about the winter of 1949. There is a particular kind of lie that is not told in words. It lives in the spaces between sentences. In the way a room goes quiet when a certain year is mentioned. In the way a grandmother's hands stop moving, just for a moment, before she changes the subject. I grew up inside that kind of lie, and for most of my life I had no idea it was there. My name is Sarah, I am 53 years old, and until 4 years ago, I believed I knew exactly what happened in the winter of 1949 in the community where I was raised. I believed it because I had been told, clearly, consistently, and by people I trusted completely. My grandmother Ruth had told me herself. She sat with me on the porch of the farmhouse the summer I turned 14, shelling butter beans into a tin bowl, and she told me that the winter of 1949 was the hardest winter the community had ever known. Deep snow, lost livestock, 3 families without enough firewood by February. She said the church had organized food sharing, that the men had hauled wood on sleds, that people had come together the way people do when the cold leaves them no other choice. She told it simply, the way she told most things, and I listened the way I always did, believing every word, filing it away as family history, as truth. She never once mentioned a name called Elias Brenneman. I did not know that name until she was dying. My grandmother Ruth lived to be 89. She was a compact, careful woman, with white hair she pinned so tightly, it seemed to pull the expression from her face. She had been married to my grandfather Jonas for 51 years before he passed. She had raised 6 children in a house with 2 bedrooms and a wood stove that required feeding every 4 hours through the night. She had done all of this without complaint, or at least without complaint that anyone was permitted to hear. She was not a cold woman, but she was a precise one. She chose what she shared with the same deliberateness she brought to everything else. A bolt of fabric cut to exactly the right length, a letter written and rewritten before sending. A story told with exactly the details required and none of the ones that were not. I adored her. My mother, who was Ruth's second youngest daughter, had a more complicated relationship with that precision. As a child, I sensed it without understanding it. There were moments when my mother would begin a sentence about her own childhood, and then stop herself, as though she had checked an internal list and found the topic restricted. There were questions she redirected with such practiced ease that I only recognized the redirection years later, looking back. Children accept the architecture of the world they are given. I accepted ours. The winter of 1949 was simply a hard winter. Difficult but communal. A story of shared survival. I repeated it to my own children once when we were talking about what hardship used to look like. I said it the way Ruth had said it to me, simply with quiet pride in the resilience of the people who had endured it. I had no reason, until my grandmother was dying, to suspect I had been repeating a careful construction rather than a memory. She asked to see me alone on the 3rd day of what would become her final week. My mother was in the kitchen, my aunt was somewhere in the yard. I went into the small back room where Ruth had been moved when the stairs became too difficult, and I sat in the chair beside her bed, and she looked at me for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "There is something in the cedar chest." I waited. The blue tin at the bottom, beneath the baptism cloth. I looked at the chest against the wall. It had always been in her bedroom. I had never been invited to open it. "What is it?" I asked. She turned her face toward the window. The light was thin and gray, the kind that belongs to late October. "Letters," she said. "And a document. You will know what to do with them when you have read them." I asked her if she wanted me to read them now, while she was still with us, while she could explain. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I changed things. I want you to know that I changed them. The others will say I was protecting the family. Maybe I was, but I want someone to know what was real." She did not say anything more about it that day. She slept. I sat with her until my mother came to take my place, and I said nothing about what Ruth had told me. I do not know why I kept it to myself so immediately. Perhaps I already sensed that sharing it would mean it would be managed before I could reach it. She died 4 days later, on a Tuesday morning, quietly the way she had done most things. I waited until after the burial to open the cedar chest. The blue tin was where she had said, beneath a folded white cloth that smelled of cedar and thyme. It was a small tin, the kind that might have held hard candies, with a fitted lid that had sealed itself with age. When I pried it open, I found 7 letters, folded small, and beneath them a single document, a handwritten page on heavier paper, the kind used for formal records, dated January 14, 1950. I read the letters first. They were written in Pennsylvania Dutch, which I can read slowly but without difficulty. They were addressed to my grandmother. They were signed in a careful hand, E. Brenneman. I did not know who that was. The first letter was brief. It spoke of gratitude, of something being received safely, of a prayer offered every morning for Ruth's well-being and for the well-being of the child. I stopped. I read that sentence again. For your well-being and for the well-being of the child. I looked at the date on that first letter. March of 1950. My mother had been born in December of 1949. I want to be honest about what I believed in that moment, because it matters that my first assumption was wrong. My first thought, sitting on the floor of my grandmother's bedroom with 7 letters in my lap, was that my grandmother had been involved with someone outside her marriage, that Elias Brenneman was the father of one of her children, and that the winter of 1949 was when that had begun or ended or been discovered. It was a reasonable conclusion. It fit the secrecy. It fit the way the year had always been spoken of as a closed chapter. I carried that belief for 3 weeks. I told my husband in general terms that I had found something in my grandmother's belongings that required more research before I shared it with the family. He is a patient man. He did not press. I drove twice to the local historical archive, where I knew there were records from several of the older Plain communities in the county. Membership rolls, property transfers, bishop correspondence that had been donated over the years by families who had left or consolidated. On my second visit, I found Elias Brenneman. He was not a man who had been involved with my grandmother in any improper way. He was a man who had delivered a baby, not a doctor, not a midwife, a farmer, a deacon in a neighboring district, and, according to the membership roll, a man who had some experience attending difficult births because the community midwife in his district had died 2 years earlier, and he had learned enough to serve in emergencies. The record I found was a transfer of care notation, the kind sometimes kept by community deacons to document their service. It listed the date, the family name, and one additional line that made my hands go still on the archive table. Child delivered healthy, second child. Not recorded with first family. Placed per prior agreement, December 28, 1949, second child. Prior agreement. My mother had been born on December 29, 1949 at least. That was the date on her birth record, the date on every document I had ever seen for her, the date we celebrated every year. She had been told she was born during the hardest winter the community had ever known, to Jonas and Ruth, their 5th child, healthy and strong. But the archive record said December 28th, and it said second child. I went back to the letters. This time I read them more slowly, with the knowledge that Elias Brenneman was a deacon who had attended a birth. With that frame, the language shifted entirely. The third letter, dated June of 1950, said, "The girl is well. She does not know she came to you from us. We have honored the agreement and do not intend to break it. But I ask once to know that she is growing well. You do not have to answer this letter. I will understand." My grandmother had answered it. The answer was folded inside the same envelope, unsent or returned. I could not tell which. It said, "She is strong and she is loved. She does not know. She will not know unless God sees fit to tell her. That is the agreement we made and the one I intend to keep, the girl. Growing well. Strong and loved, my mother." I need to explain what I understood at this point and what I still did not understand, because the reconstruction was not finished. What I now believed, my mother had been born to a woman in a neighboring district, perhaps the woman, perhaps one in difficult circumstances, and had been placed with Ruth and Jonas through some quiet arrangement involving Elias Brenneman as facilitating deacon. The date had been adjusted by 1 day. The birth had been absorbed into the family as Ruth's own. The community had been told nothing, or had been told a version that did not include placement. The winter of 1949 had been built around this event like scaffolding, something big enough to explain why that year was different, why Ruth sometimes looked out the window when the calendar turned to December, why the subject of that winter ended conversations instead of continuing them. That was what I believed for another 2 months. Then I found the document. I had been reading the letters so carefully that I had set the heavier page aside and only returned to it when I had nothing left to learn from the correspondence. It was a formal agreement, written in English rather than Pennsylvania Dutch. The kind of language used when a record needed to be clear to anyone who might later read it, not only to those inside the community. It was signed by 4 people: Jonas Byler, Ruth Byler, Elias Brenneman, and a 4th name, Hannah Brenneman. Hannah was Elias's wife. The document was not a placement agreement. It was something older, more plainly written, and harder to read than anything I had expected. It was an agreement to divide the care of twins. I read that word 3 times. Twins. The agreement stated that Hannah Brenneman had delivered 2 girls on December 27, 1949, one day earlier than either of the dates I had been given, and that, due to circumstances described only as the difficulty of provision, the 2 children would be raised in separate households. Ruth and Jonas would take one. Elias and Hannah would keep one. Neither child would be told. Neither household would make contact except through Elias, and only to confirm the children's well-being. The agreement was signed in January of 1950, witnessed by the bishop of Elias's district, whose name I recognized from the archive records. My mother had a twin sister. She had grown up 7 miles away, in a neighboring community, and she had never known. I sat with that knowledge for a long time before I decided what to do with it. Part of me wanted to put the tin back in the cedar chest and close the lid and let the winter of 1949 remain what it had always been, a hard season, communal survival, a closed chapter. I understood for the first time in my life the appeal of that choice. Ruth had made it, Jonas had made it. Elias and Hannah had made it. They had made it not out of cruelty, I believe, but out of the particular arithmetic of survival that poverty and religious community and private shame can sometimes produce. The calculation that 2 children raised in ignorance of each other is a lesser harm than 2 children raised in hardship together. And that silence, maintained long enough, would eventually become its own kind of mercy. I do not agree with that arithmetic, but I no longer believe it was made without love. The harder question was my mother. She was 74 years old. She had buried her husband. She had grandchildren she adored. She had built a life on an understanding of herself, her origins, her family, her people. That was in every important factual sense incorrect. And there was a woman 7 miles from where she had grown up, the same age as her to the day, who had lived that same life in parallel, who had perhaps also been told that the winter of 1949 was simply a hard winter. I called the archive again. I asked whether there were any records for the Brenneman family after 1955. The archivist was kind. She found a marriage record. The daughter of Elias and Hannah Brenneman, first name listed as Miriam, had married in 1970 and was recorded under her husband's name thereafter. I found her through a genealogy registry, the kind that plain families sometimes use when they have partially transitioned to modern record keeping. Her listing included a contact through a family member. I wrote a letter. I said I had found something in a family record that I believed affected her, and that I would share it completely if she wished to know, or leave it entirely alone if she did not. I said there was no pressure and no urgency, that whatever she decided was right. She called me 11 days later. I will not describe that conversation in full because it belongs to her as much as it belongs to me, and some things are not mine to narrate. But I will say this, her voice sounded like my mother's. Not exactly, not in every word, but in the rhythm of it, in the way she paused before a difficult sentence. Exactly the way my mother pauses. Exactly the way I have paused my entire life without knowing where it came from. She had not known. She had also been raised on a version of 1949 that mentioned hardship and community and survival and nothing more. She had wondered, she told me, in the vague way that some people wonder, whether there was something her parents had not told her. But the wondering had never had a shape. It had just been a feeling, quiet and unspecific, like a room in a house whose door you have always passed without opening. Her parents had both died. She had siblings, biological siblings, Elias and Hannah's other children, but none of them had been told either. We agreed, after several more conversations, that the decision of whether to tell our mothers belonged to our mothers. We met in person in the spring. She drove to a diner between our 2 communities, a plain building at a crossroads, and we sat across from each other for 3 hours. And I watched her hands move when she talked and recognized the gesture. The particular way of pressing the fingers together when searching for a word, as one I had watched my mother make 1,000 times. I brought the tin. I gave her the letters addressed to her parents. I kept the ones addressed to Ruth and Jonas. We each kept a copy of the document. My mother is 78 now. We told her in the late summer of that year, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she had not touched, going cold beside her hand. She did not speak for a long time after I explained it. She looked at the document. She looked at the photograph I had found of Elias and Hannah, a formal photo. The kind taken at a district gathering, and she studied Hannah's face with an expression I could not fully read. Something between recognition and grief and something quieter. Finally, she said, "She kept us together by keeping us apart." I asked her what she meant. "If they had tried to keep us together," my mother said, "we might have lost both of us. Two more children in a house that already couldn't hold what it had." She was quiet for a moment. "She gave me to people who could feed me. That was love. It just didn't look the way love is supposed to look." She asked to meet Miriam. They met the following October on Miriam's porch, and I did not go with her. That was also my mother's choice, and I honored it. She came home that evening, and she was different in a way I recognized but could not name. Not happier, exactly, not healed. But something had been completed in her that had been open for 74 years, without her knowing it was open. I think about Ruth now, and I try to be honest with myself about what she was. She was a woman who took a child that was not hers, and raised her with complete devotion, and told her a history that was constructed rather than true. She was a woman who knew, every December of her long life, that somewhere a few miles away there was another girl growing up who shared her daughter face, and she said nothing. She was a woman who kept 7 letters in a tin box for 60 years rather than burning them, which tells me she could not entirely silence the part of herself that wanted the truth to survive her. On the last afternoon I sat with her, she said she had changed things. She wanted someone to know what was real. She chose me. I have thought about why. I think she chose me because I was young enough to still have time to do something with the truth, and old enough to carry it carefully. I think she chose me because she had watched me over the years and concluded that I would not use it as a weapon. I hope she was right about that. The winter of 1949 was not only a hard winter in our community, it was the winter a young woman gave birth to 2 daughters in a cold house and could not keep them both. It was the winter a childless couple drove 7 miles on a frozen road and came home with a child they would love as completely as any they had made themselves. It was the winter an agreement was written by hand on heavy paper, witnessed by a bishop, and then hidden for 6 decades inside a blue tin beneath a baptism cloth in a cedar chest that no one was permitted to open. It was the winter my grandmother became my mother's mother. That is the truest version I have. It is not simple, and it is not comfortable, and it does not flatten into the kind of story that can be told quickly and set aside. But it is what was real. I still have the tin. Sits on my shelf now with the letters folded back inside it, and the document on top where I can find it if I need it. Sometimes when I pass it I think of Ruth on that October afternoon, the gray light through the window, her face turned away from me. She changed every story she told about that winter, but in the end she left the truth where she knew I would find it. That was the last thing she changed.